Christopher Sebastian is a journalist, technical writer, and digital media specialist. He is the director of social media for Peace Advocacy Network. He sits on the advisory council for Encompass. He is a senior fellow at Sentient Media, and he's a co-founder of VGN. Christopher writes about media theory for animal rights and lectures at Columbia University in the Department of Social Work with a focus on how human relationships with other animals shapes our attitudes about race, sexuality, and class. Christopher believes veganism is a useful tool for deconstructing multiple systemic oppressions. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Christopher.
Thank you, my pleasure. I really appreciate you bringing me on.
Oh, I really appreciate you being here. And before we get going, I just want to say that I try to recognize my white privilege, and I'm a first generation Canadian born. It's from British parents who immigrated to Canada after serving in World War II and trying to find a better world for their children. So, but it wasn't until college and university that I began to learn about the plight of non-white people in the world. And so many of us now are just waking up from the true horrors of genocide that happened to the first Indigenous peoples here in Canada as well. Apparently, they found another gravesite in Saskatchewan now. So I just want to thank you for your willingness to help educate people like myself. And please forgive me in advance if my white privilege shows up in any way.
No, not a problem. Thank you.
Um, Thank you. And so when did you step onto the vegan path? I always like to know people's vegan story.
Oh, my vegan story is not unique. Like many people, I found out about veganism and I jumped right on it. I didn't have like a transition period that started with vegetarianism. I read the book Skinny Bitch actually in 2004, which I actually enjoyed telling the story. I used to be really ashamed of it, but yeah, like I picked it up in an airport, and it was like a bestseller at the time. And I picked it up thinking that it was a diet book. And I was returning from a work trip, and so I thought that it would be good plain reading. And somewhere around the third chapter, like it took a hard pivot into talking about animal exploitation, and I was horrified, absolutely horrified. And by the time the plane landed, I was completely vegan, which doesn't mean that I didn't have slip ups or like I didn't. I just was automatically the perfect vegan right away. Obviously, like there were some challenging times in the first couple of years. But yeah, like just the idea that I should start with vegetarianism that didn't actually happen for me. Although it does happen for a lot of people. And so like I don't think that like there's anything wrong with going on that particular journey, but like this was how it happened for me. But it wasn't until several years later that I actually had been introduced to a more feminist understanding of veganism when I read The Sexual Politics of Meat. And I always love to tell people that one of my earliest um, inspirations was Carol Adams, and she wrote that book in 1990, and I still feel like even right now it is perhaps more important than it was at the time that it was released. And of course, there have been several more editions since then. But that really shifted my perspective because up until that time, I was just thinking of veganism as like this sort of single issue thing, and like siloing it off from all of the other issues that it was very obviously connected to. And so reading Adam's work and being introduced to this sort of ecofeminist framing of veganism was absolutely an emotional experience. And it really started me down the path of interrogating, if this is the ecofeminist connection, then what are the racialized implications of like animal exploitation as well? And then I discovered all of the reading about that, and so forth and so on. And so that was, that was my path.
Wow, so that radically transformed your existence pretty much right away then, starting right away and then evolving. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's interesting because the skinny bitch, I've heard some sort of feminist critique of that now in terms of, I guess, like fat shaming. I haven't actually read it. Like in retrospect now with your new feminist perspective, you know, it's just cautionary, I guess, for people who are picking up different books because, you know, becoming vegan can trigger a lot of other stuff in us, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like what happened with me was like, this is why I say that like I used to be embarrassed about telling the story, but now I find that there's actually a lot of power in talking about it and being like, open and like, and authentic about like what my early experiences were and why they were different, and why it's important to talk about that. Like, because of course, like everyone's like point of entry is going to be different. And so I don't need to be ashamed of the fact that that this was my own, and that like that there are very obviously feminist implications of the framing that the authors of that particular book had. And I really do wonder if they would have written it a different way, like with it being like 15, 16 years later now, what that would look like. Because like the fat shaming and like the promotion of diet culture and the promotion of like just image consciousness that it has, it's very clear to me now in retrospect how damaging and harmful that was. And I can appreciate why people would use that as a hook because of the type of culture that we're all accustomed to. But it is a very one-dimensional, very like not very class focused or class conscious like look at animal rights. And so, yeah, like I do wonder what the authors would do with that at this time, or how differently they would have written it. But that was again, like, that was my introduction. And it was actually Carol Adams herself who helped me like to realize that like, hey, there's nothing to be ashamed of here. Because of course, like we're all like, we're all on a different path, and look at where you are right now. And and that was one of the like kindest and wisest things that like that she said to me. So I always tell people about that.
Yeah, I think we're all damaged goods from, and it's nobody's really to blame, I guess. My parents were brought up with meat and potatoes, and so they infused that in my life. And, I think from that first bite of animal, we begin on this journey that we have to completely unravel then eventually if we're willing. And so, and Carol Adams, pardon me, she was speaking recently with Earth Save. It's an online event, and she was basically talking about how things really haven't changed a lot in terms of the sexualization of meat and the feminist imagery, of like pigs dressed up with little bikinis to try to sell pork rinds or whatever. It's kind of scary how much hasn't shifted. So you've been vegan at least like 15 years then. Have you seen a growth in the sort of expansion of understanding of what veganism is, that it's more than just a diet?
I do actually. And I know that perhaps others would disagree with me, but I do think that there has been an expansion. I think that there is a collective awakening that comes from the fact that there are more socially engaged people who are taking on these ideas. And the resistance to it, I think, also is very telling, because the more resistance we actually see being built up from other people, that tells you that like the dominant culture is actually a little bit nervous. And so like the more dominant hegemonic position is being threatened. And so of course the response to that is to be like even more enraged or antagonistic toward these ideas about speciesism being introduced into the culture, because that fear that comes from losing that dominance is definitely going to drive that. And so yeah, like I think that like that is, that's part of the growing pains of the expansion of these ideas and the widespread adoption of them. And like just the accessibility as well of information on the internet. Not all of it great, but the accessibility of so much more information actually makes it very easy for people to stumble across those who would influence you or inspire you to take on a plant-based diet, or to understand that animal exploitation is is something that's harmful to every one of us as minoritized people living on this planet.
And you've talked about sort of toxic masculinity, and it seems like a lot of the backlash, I think perhaps that you're speaking of, is coming from kind of white macho guys who want to maintain their status in the world, and somehow everything is threatening to that, and especially the idea of living a plant-based lifestyle. And Carol, of course, writes a lot about that. You know, as a man and a gay man on the planet, what do you want to say to men who are sort of cautious about, losing their masculinity, concerned about losing their masculinity if they were to find this compassion within them for the animals?
Yeah, I actually it's really funny that you mentioned that. I actually did a presentation last year based on some research that I had been collecting in 2019 around like around the consumption of meat and identity. And of course, as I said in the beginning, a lot of my work is inspired by the work of people like Adams or Patrice Jones and Dr. Brees Harper and others like that. And when I had started looking at the way that identity is connected to our exploitation of other animals and the consumption of animal products in the 21st century, a really clear political picture started to unfold, because so much of the way that we consume animals and exploit animals in the United States is not just, it's wrapped up in a very specific type of identity. And so looking at identity politics, and in particular white identity politics, you start to see this image of of people who are holding most firmly to these outdated ideals of masculinity. It's it's very prevalent in this culture of white nationalism that we have in the US, where I'm from. And so the people, and even right now, it's perhaps more so now in 2021, what we're looking at is mainstream newspaper articles that are talking about how the consumption of meat has become the new front in the culture wars. And of course it has, but it always has been. It's always been a weapon in the culture wars. Going back over the past 200 years of American history, if not longer, it has been a mainstay. There have been entire books written about how the expansion of cattle ranching was one of the driving factors of the genocide against Native Americans, and the accumulation of land for the purposes of of ranching and farming is that can't be separated from the violence against Native American people. And so that's part of our history. And the birth of the cowboy as an image of American iconography, that's part of our history, and what the cowboy represents and what it says about us and what the cowboy would consume and what his literal job was in the American West. And so the mythology that's created around these images is part of Americana. And so when you hear political figures in the 21st century, particularly conservative, mostly white, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual white men with money, playing on these these tropes of oh, the liberals, quote, are going to come and they're going to take your meat, or they're going to take your burgers. They're actually drawing on hundreds of years of history that that all is tied up in the objectified body or bodies of animals. And so that's that's this observation that I think vastly gets overlooked in mainstream circles, because to most of us a hamburger is simply a hamburger, or a steak is simply a steak. But really there's so much more represented by this this body part of someone who is and was objectified in life and in death. And so it represents so much more. And like what it largely does represent is our attachment to domination over other persons, minoritized persons, irrespective of their species. And so when we actually start to look at it from that perspective, it becomes less about, oh, like, someone taking away my meat. And we actually start to recognize our place and our identities in this constant struggle for liberation, for Black liberation, for women's liberation, for queer liberation. And start to recognize that these are our comrades with whom we should be seeking solidarity rather than looking at them as objects or as like exploitable resources or goods in a grocery store or a restaurant. And that's the direction that I hope more of us actually lean into. And I do see more of us leaning into it, and I'm very glad about that.
Do you notice a difference in Europe where you're located currently? I mean, I think the lands of Europe were also, and the whole world was cleared for agriculture. I've heard it said that as soon as the first seed was dropped in the earth for agriculture, our nomadic lifestyle became more domesticated, and so the whole everything shifted from there. But it's so much, so much time has passed in Europe since that happened compared to North America, South America. Do you notice a difference in attitude in Europe generally?
I do notice a shift in attitudes in Europe. It's not happening as quickly as I would like to see it. And perhaps that is like, perhaps my bias or my perspective is grounded in the fact that like most of the European continent, I haven't traveled. Like I've lived in Germany, I've lived in the Czech Republic, I've lived in England. And like, and I've visited like other countries still, like Sweden, like the Netherlands and Austria. And so like I can only speak from my specific experiences, and I haven't done as much research as I would like to have done on that. But like what I can say is that one of the things that I hear people repeat to me over and over as Europeans is that like what I'm bringing is my American perspective, and these are all American problems, and like we don't have this in Europe, or this is not part of European history. And so all of the racism and sexism and like and homo antagonism that you described, that's not us. We'd have nothing to do with that. We're very evolved, we're very civilized, we treat our animals differently and so much better. But you
They
have to
still
actually
kill them. They still kill them, though,
we
right?
still go them, but
Right.
it's all about the treatment. So like we're going
Right.
to center the conversation on the treatment, which is again like completely false itself. And like and so like I push back on that a whole lot, because like it's very like unsophisticated, shall we say, to place this like in such overly simplistic terms as though like this is just an American problem and these are American things and you are American, ergo this doesn't apply. But like you can't untie the history of these United States from Europe, because the people who colonized the country are themselves European. Like like so like you can't take away from like the very real history of like the agricultural revolution, which started in England. And you can't like you can't erase or gloss over the industrial revolution, which also started in Europe. And like when you combine these things together, like the globalization of industrial animal agriculture, it's tied to European history because this is where it began.
Mm.
Like the first actual cowboys were actually European themselves. Like you like when you colonize places like South America and introduce all of these species to these places that didn't exist there before, then you start to see a very clear picture of like of the connections between race and species, and how one is weaponized against the other and vice versa. And like as part of the presentation that I had done last year, and I've done it several times since then, like I actually use examples from not just from Europe but also from Australia. Like the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison like had said, in response to animal activists who were protesting cattle farming themselves, that they were un-Australian. And that's, I feel like, a really telling statement, because what you're saying is that, like, to protest against the farming of these animals is un-Australian, and that makes you un-Australian. But what you're really saying is, like, this is anti-white, or I don't want to recognize, like, it makes me uncomfortable to recognize the role the whiteness plays in this. Because the top animals that are exported from Australia are, I believe, like, of course, like cows, sheep, and goat. Those are the, like, the primary meat exports, and none of those animals are indigenous to Australia.
Right.
Like, they were introduced by Europeans. And so when you say, oh, this is un-Australian, what do you mean un-Australian? Because these animals are themselves not Australian. And what you're saying is that, like, to reject these products of, like, of European heritage is, like, that makes you against my principles. And so, like, and that's the reality of it. And people want to look at it through this one-dimensional lens, and it's like, no, like, this is incredibly racist. And this isn't to say that, like, the indigenous people of Australia or the First Nations people didn't consume animals. Of course they did. But the point is that, like, that these animals, like, and your instrumentalization of them is itself a racist act. And you're wrapping up those animal identities with your own white identity, and that is, like, an act of speciesism and of racism. And, like, and you can't decouple those things from one another, because that's literally just the history. And it's astounding to me how many people, like, exhibit their fragility when they first hear about this, because it's like, oh, you can't say these things, and, like, like, this is, like, this is against my culture or whatever, or, like, you're being anti-white or whatever have you. And it's like, this is just me, like, contextualizing the reality of what actually happened. I'm not rewriting history. I'm not revising history in any way. I'm merely, like, making observations about the history the way that it exists right now. And it's up to you to handle or to manage your emotional response to that. I cannot be responsible for your, like, for your own fragility. But that just means that other people have to do, quote, the work. And yeah, like, and some of us are prepared to do it, but most of us are not, or I should say not yet. But we stay hopeful.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think COVID has shown us that we can change. We can change our behaviors and we can change our attitudes and we can learn new things and think perhaps more critically about what's going on and who's telling us what. And it's interesting to consider that the indigenous peoples, yeah, they consumed animals, but they didn't forcefully breed them and factory farm them and export them around the world, for profit, right? There's definitely a big divide there. I like where you talk about how veganism, you've written, veganism is the most comprehensive way to resist the violence associated with the subjugation and oppression of non-white groups. So I think you're suggesting that through veganism, we can really understand all different kinds of oppression in our world.
Absolutely, yes. Like, one of the things that I learned, through researching, like, sociology and psychology, is, like, is learning that, like, the psychology of racism actually mirrors the psychology of, like, of human exceptionalism, a great deal. And one of my former professors that I interviewed, Dr. Joseph Dodds, he actually was talking about how we when we create these in groups and out groups, we're, like, we're sort of constructing these boundaries. And, like, the more heavily invested we are in these identities, the more, like, the more violently we have to police these boundaries that we construct. And we see that very clearly with anti-Black racism. But we tend to not see it so clearly when it comes to other animals, which, to me, like, just objectively speaking, is one of the worst acts of violence that we routinely commit several times a day, and then render it invisible. And, like, the sheer audacity of that act should alarm us, but it's so normalized in our culture that we don't even see it. And so, like, yeah, like, when I say that, like, this is a means of, like, of like, helping to liberate several different minoritized groups, I mean that very directly, because, like, we can't look at animal justice in isolation. Like, this is a matter of reproductive justice. This is a matter of reproductive and bodily autonomy. This is a matter of discrimination and of bigotry. This is an issue of, like, you know, of ableism and of disability justice. When you actually, and so, like, I don't look at animal rights as separate from these movements, but an extension, and a very logical extension of these movements as well. We just draw the line at species. And again, like, you know, we're drawing that, like, you know, we're drawing that boundary, and we're policing it with violence because we don't want to recognize the reality of human exceptionalism. Some of us are so invested in that mythology that we deny the fact that we are animals and become quite indignant at that recognition when it's brought up. And, like, you know, and it's messed up our, like, you know, our psyches, and, like, you know, and our emotional well-being so much that it's actually weaponized in so many circumstances. When you see, like, you know, when you see dominant groups actually comparing minoritized groups to animals, that's one of the ways that it's weaponized. See, you are, like, you know, these people are like animals. And then, like, we internalize this, and, like, you know, and we instead of actually seeking solidarity with animals, we actually say, no, like, you know, like, we are human, which of course we are, but the implication is that there's something bad about the animal as an identity itself, or something wrong about the animal as an identity itself that we need to distance ourselves from. And so in many ways, we're actually just buying into and reinforcing this narrative that was given to us by the dominant and hegemonic group. And so, like, you know, how can we ever be free when, like, you know, when we continue to do that, because we're just keeping the hierarchy in place. And there's this fantastic quote from Angela Davis. She said this ages and ages ago that, and I'll bastardize the quote because I don't remember it exactly word for word, but she said that, like, one of the greatest obstacles to liberation are, or two of the greatest obstacles to our liberation are white women and Black men. And the reason being that white women and Black men view liberation as being consistent with attaining what white men have, without recognizing that what white men have is contingent on the oppression of others. And so, like, you know, and so we continue to reproduce that over and over and over again, the more we try to distance ourselves from our animal brothers and sisters and family members. And it does us such a psychic harm that, like, we don't even recognize that this domination, this stranglehold that we have on other species is literally killing us and everyone else on this planet. And we are so invested in it that we would rather see ourselves die than let that stranglehold go. And so, like, what is there to do but try to educate people in the meantime and help us make that connection and reawaken in ourselves, like, you know, the power of solidarity that we have with other species, with other minoritized groups on this planet that don't share our species, so that we can truly be free. And that is, of course, a tall order, but what else are we going to do?
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting how deep this speciesism it goes. So, you know, I've spoken about speciesism with various people. I've brought up the term. Perhaps you could define that term for us, and then talk a bit about how our language also, you know, encourages us to always remember that we perceive ourselves as the dominant species. For example, I hear progressive-minded, really loving, but otherwise non-vegan people saying, "Oh, those pigs, you know, how could they behave like that?" And I'm thinking, well, pigs don't do that, you know. And I'm constantly typing into the chat, but you know, and so it just seems like it's this constant reinforcement of this idea that we are the superior ones and they are other, and we can do what we want with them.
That's totally true. When I think about speciesism, I think that the easiest and most direct way of defining it is, like, you know, like bigotry or discrimination toward other animals that don't share the human species. We, like, you know, and of course we've institutionalized this and on every level. And so, like, you know, and so that in that way, it's not dissimilar from racism or sexism or, like, you know, or any of the other quote isms that we have. And you are correct that like our language absolutely reinforces this in every way. In fact, like Joan Dunnier, I believe she wrote a book on like, you know, on our use of language. But one of the things that I find to be most compelling is that when you say that like, you know, our language reinforces these things and we kind of attribute these negative traits and negative characteristics to other animals, like it happens on multiple levels, doesn't it? Like, because we're actually weaponizing animals in this way to discredit some aspect of someone's character. And so very often when I'm talking to people, they kind of frame anthropomorphism as like, oh, you're anthropomorphizing other animals. You're like, you know, you're attributing human characteristics to other animals. Like you're making statements about other animals' well-being or their emotional state based on what you project onto them. And all the while we never recognize that we're actually projecting like, you know, our negative characteristics onto animals all the time. And if I can make another like political observation or use another politics example, like when we look at, for example, the 2020 presidential election or the Democratic primary leading up to the presidential election in the United States, when people were choosing their candidate, there was like a candidate like group or stream of people that it was like dozens of people all wanting to be president after Donald Trump. And I don't blame them, by the way. But like, you know, when people were choosing their team or choosing their in-group, very frequently they would use animal stand-ins or in many ways an animal totem to represent the person or persons that they didn't like. And so if you were team, for example, Bernie Sanders, like, you know, then many people would get on social media and like and sort of instrumentalize or weaponize social media to like, you know, to turn against Elizabeth Warren. And one of the ways that people had done that online was to like, you know, to put snake emojis all throughout her social media posts. And like this, of course, like betrays a degree of sexism. But like, it's why did they do that? Because of what the snake actually represents. And so we attribute like, you know, like we attribute like, you know, betrayal, or like, you know, or dishonesty to like to snakes. Like, you know, we see it in a religious context, like the serpent is who introduced Eve to the apple, or like, you know, whispered in her ear, trying to convince her to eat an apple. In the very first Christian Bible story that we're ever taught. And like Pete Buttigieg, not my favorite candidate either, by the way, but like, you know, like whether, like regardless of who you were for, if you were against Pete Buttigieg, people very frequently depicted him as a rat, like superimposing his face onto rat bodies, or like, you know, or like, you know, drawing him in a way that like was resembling of rats. And like so we see animals actually being anthropomorphized in this way, in a way that like, you know, projects all of our negative traits onto them. And like, you know, and kind of like trying to divorce ourselves or distance ourselves from those negative traits by portraying these people as animals, and in a way that like, you know, dehumanizes them and animalizes and animalizes instead. And we see that with like, you know, with minoritized groups, or groups that we don't like all the time. Like when we talk about the quote lizard people, like, you know, there are very anti-Semitic undertones to that. When like, you know, like the number of times and the number of examples that I have used over and over again, where Black people, and in particular Black women, are compared to apes and to monkeys. The number of like images that exist on the internet of Michelle Obama being like, you know, like gorilla-fied, of Serena Williams, which means that like, you know, you're not only dehumanizing them, but also defeminizing them. And like, you know, and creating this sort of perceived masculinity of Black womanhood, which is an extension of like, you know, of misogynoir. And so, like, you know, we see these several examples over and over and over and over again. And like, you know, and you cannot, like I said before, you cannot decouple the speciesism from anti-Blackness, from the racism of it all, from the sexism of it all, from the homo antagonism or homophobia of it all. When we're talking about Elizabeth Warren as a presidential candidate, and like, you know, and using these sexist like tropes against her, saying that she lies and she's like a snake. Or Pete Buttigieg, who was our like, you know, out like out gay presidential candidate, and like, and depicting him as a rat. And like, whether or not you think that these politicians are good or bad people, like, like to actually attribute these characteristics to them and depict them as animals that we think of as bad, that does a harm collectively to all women, to all gay people, to all Black people. And it actually starts with the harm that we do to other animals. So that's absolutely a thing that happens.
So if we were living in a vegan world and somebody called us a rat or a snake or a monkey, we would say, "Cool, I love those attributes." It's interesting that the Chinese calendar has animals each year and we're supposed to embrace the qualities, the wonderful qualities of those animals. But
The great irony is that I am a rat
Oh, cool.
on the
Okay.
Chinese calendar. So
And I've heard rats are really intelligent but they've been charged with carrying and distributing the plague. Well, where did the plague come from in the first place? It wasn't the rats who created the plague. Yeah, there's a lot to think about there, isn't there? So, let's see what else. We've got a few minutes left. Is there anything in particular that you're working on right now that you'd like to share information about?
absolutely, yeah. Like right now, I actually am working on making a book out of like these observations that I have been making, encouraged, of course, by Carol Adams herself. Like that actually picks up on these political observations and like the sort of the hyper speciesism that we've been experiencing in the past 10 years. And sort of examining that and the way that it's been weaponized in the political discourse, particularly in the United States, just so that we can help people to understand or give people a reference point for how this occurs and like and what it actually looks like and what the consequences of it are for like for people like for minoritized people and for the planet. And so like that's one project that I'm working on.
Do you happen to know the origin of the elephant and the donkey thing in American politics?
I don't off the top of my head, like I wouldn't be able to speak about that very well, but like, but of course it's not uncommon for people to actually choose like animal mascots for sports teams, for like, for political discourse or anything. But it's funny that you should mention that because of course, like when we do talk about like, animals positively or like positive attributes that we would want to like, attribute to animals or want to like, place on humans, it's a very similar thing that happens, but in reverse when we want to actually look at ourselves as particularly like brave or like or agile, like that bravery is attributed to like like oh like this person is like a lion or like agility, like this person is like swift and like and very light on their feet like a gazelle. And but we never talk about that as anthropomorphism, do we? We never recognize that like that's okay, like like as long as we're benefiting from it in some way or we're able to weaponize it in some way, we don't call it anthropomorphism. But like but as soon as you actually start to recognize the very real and measurable and quantifiable experiences of other animals, to lift them up out of their objectification, then it's a problem. And so like and that's like that's such a real thing to observe as well. But yeah, like I digress. But yeah, like so like you were asking specifically about like the positive use of animals for like in our political discourse. I don't have an answer for that one. But yeah, like it's very interesting to observe that like we use animals in every conceivable way, as long as it's to our benefit, but never to their own.
Right. So you're saying I haven't heard that backlash that when you tried. So you're saying you try to suggest that animals have feelings and that they feel pain and that they want to live their own lives, and that's considered anthropomorphizing them.
Yeah, like, what do you know about animal happiness? Well, I know that my dog wags his tail when he sees me when I come home. That seems like, like animals communicate in several nonverbal ways. And so it's very easy to discern most of the time. Like we can work out, like, when they're happy and when they're not. I just can't help but think that, like, like their objectification or the lack of obvious signs of distress to us and to our perceptions means that it's perfectly fine to continue exploiting them. But yeah, when you introduce that into conversation, it makes people uncomfortable and they say, oh, you don't know anything about animal emotions. You're just attributing human values onto them. That's your anthropomorphism speaking. And you're a biased person without recognizing that, like, overwhelmingly our collective bias is toward, like, our, like, perceived human exceptionalism, and that, like, and that we're somehow better than other animals, when we're not. We're just one more species of persons that are crawling around on this rock that we call Earth.
I'm remembering Dr. Salish Rao. He speaks about how we were the original prey. We were the ultimate prey at one time. Like we had nothing to. We didn't have fire. We didn't have weapons, and so we've gone from that to becoming the ultimate predator. What's gone on with our psyche, and what's happened to our DNA in this. We're the same species, but we're so completely radically different from what we started out to be. There's got to be some better middle ground here on how we can live on the planet. Otherwise, we're just not going to be able to live here. And so what about COVID? How is that informing the way that you're analyzing and philosophizing, and what can we learn from this experience as we try to move forward?
There's so much to learn. There's a lot of misinformation out there about COVID, and, like, for better or for worse, whether or not it makes me popular, like, I acknowledge that we don't actually know where COVID came from. We don't know if it did start in a wet market. We haven't actually isolated that as the definitive cause. We don't know if it came from a lab, and right now in the news media, we are re-examining the lab leak theory, or the lab leak possibility of, like, of COVID's origins. But what we can say is that, like, irrespective of whether it came from a wet market or whether it came from a laboratory, like, it is most likely caused by animal origin. Whether it was our experimentation or, like, our consumption, there was an exploitation or a violation of bodily autonomy that had clearly taken place at one point, or at several points. And, like, so, like, as a zoonotic disease that has emerged, like, we're actually watching in real time what the consequences of this are. We've seen it happen over and over and over again, because this is not, like, like, the novel coronavirus is new, but the idea of, like, of exploiting animals and, like, and having consequences for humans medically, is not. We've seen, like, the avian flu, we've seen the swine flu, we've seen, like, all of these different ways in which, like, we become sick from the consumption of other animals. And it pains me to think that we have not learned the lesson. It pains me that, like, in order for us to, like, have a vaccine, like, to, like, to prevent us from, like, from being completely destroyed by this disease, like, there's more animal exploitation, and experimentation that takes place. And, like, until we learn the lesson, we're just going to continue to experience these, like, these negative outcomes for ourselves and for everyone else. And, like I said, it stems from ultimately that stranglehold that we just don't want to let go of. And it absolutely mirrors, like, the stranglehold that, like, the male patriarchal domination has over women, that, like, that white supremacist violence has against, like, against people of color. Like, I think that, like, at the end of the day, it's a quote from, I believe it's, like, James Gilligan, who is a psychologist. Like, he said that, like, every act of violence originates from, like, trying to replace, like, like trying to replace self-esteem, with, like, with this violence in some way. There's a loss of power that we're experiencing, and that's what causes every act of violence. And again, I'm, like, completely, like, ruining that quote, but I think that's that's a very real thing. Like, all of our violence actually comes from something, like, some sort of loss that we're experiencing in ourselves, and causes us to be violent against others. And that's what we're experiencing as humans, like, being faced with our mortality, being faced with, like, the reality that we're not very special. on this planet. Um, and yeah, that's mirrored in like in the like the violence that we see like that men like like visit upon women, that white people visit upon black people on this planet, and like and the attachment to that stranglehold, like it's going to kill us all. It's going to kill us all. Anti-blackness will absolutely kill us all. Like patriarchy will kill us all. And like and that's like and that domination over other animals that we can't let go of, that is going to absolutely kill us all until we learn how to live on this planet with one another. Like we're absolutely like just roller skating right into oblivion, and we don't even care. So something has to change very soon.
Here. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Christopher, for taking the time. I really appreciate all that you've said. I'm going to have to go and think about a lot of things now again, and I think it's important that we think about these things, and rather than just barreling through and oh, now we've got a vaccine so we can go back to normal, whatever that was. And is there anything that you'd like to say as we leave here?
Just thank you so much for having me. I really had a great time today.
Me too. And so, where can people find more information, your writings or your lectures? Is there some online place we can go?
Absolutely. My website is www.christophersebastian.info, not .com, and Christopher Sebastian is one word. You can also find me on Facebook and Instagram. My Instagram handle is the_Christopher_Sebastian. And like you'll definitely find me on Facebook if you just type me in, much to my chagrin. Like it's like I'm very obviously there.
All
And
right.
of course, my writing is housed on Sentient Media as well. I've been writing for them for the past couple of years.
Sentient Media, yeah, they're awesome. Okay. All right. Well, thank you again. Appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate you.